In just 3 weeks' time, Libya is scheduled to hold its first ever presidential election. But with no ratified constitution, scattered electoral laws, and a nation divided by war, could a vote lead to further chaos? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Libya's upcoming election. The list of 98 candidates so far is long and controversial. Some of the more notable names include warlord Khalifa Haftar and Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi. Both have been disqualified from running by different authorities. But with their appeals waiting further judgment from Libyan courts, it's still not known who exactly will be on that final list. The chaotic nature of the planned poll has Libyans divided, not just over whom to vote for, but on whether the country is ready for an election at all.
We are pushing for elections. We maintain this right, but on one condition, that there be a constitution to determine the relation between the ruler and the governed, be a defined time period and other factors. Meaning the rights and duties of the two parties should be defined, or that there's a constitutional base to be agreed upon until the referendum on the constitution is completed.
In principle, we can say at least it's an achievement. It's a beginning to establishing a state and stability and democracy.
We're with the elections, with the principle of the elections and a peaceful transfer of power, with the Constitution, the law. The only way to bring about permanent stability is to hold elections. But these elections need to be held on the basis of real laws, on a constitutional basis, or a referendum on the Constitution.
All Libyans should come to vote, otherwise how can we build Libya? We need to build Libya with elections, and God willing, the elections will take place on time. God willing, it will go well and be a good introduction to a new Libya.
So while many may want to vote, Libya still has no ratified constitution nor enshrined electoral laws, which throws the legitimacy of any election into question. To make matters worse, Jan Kubis, the United Nations Special Envoy to Libya, abruptly resigned just weeks before the vote, but then said he was willing to remain in the role until the election.
In the resignation letter to the Secretary General, I also confirmed my readiness to continue as the Special Envoy for a transitional period, and that, in my opinion, should cover the electoral period, to ensure business continuity, provided that it is a feasible option. I hope an appropriate solution will be found.
Well, how much business continuity the UN envoy can ensure is up for debate. The country has remained in a constant state of conflict since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. Divisions and fighting have split the country. The oil-rich region in the east is controlled by warlord Khalifa Haftar, and the UN-backed government of Prime Minister Abdul Hamid Dbeibah rules the west. The fractured nature of the North African nation has made progress difficult at best. The UN said elections are the essential next step toward peace and stability, but some say a vote could lead to more conflict. So could elections potentially solve or create more instability in Libya? And who might be up for election on December 24th if the vote happens? Well, here to discuss that, I'm joined from Tripoli by Salah Elbakkoush. He was an advisor to Libya's High Council of States negotiating team. From London is Sami Hamdi, the editor-in-chief of the International Interest. And also in the British capital is Tim Eaton, a senior research fellow in Chatham House's Middle East and North Africa program. Thanks all so much for being with us. You know, Salah, last time we spoke, you sounded very skeptical that elections could even happen because not only was the basic infrastructure not there, but there was also a serious lack of security. So fast forward to today, has anything improved?
Not at all. Unfortunately, that prediction is true today as it was a few weeks ago. I mean, look, what we have now is a very interesting situation. Professor Simon Maber of Lancaster University described it this way. He said Libya is trying to enter a post-conflict context without the conflict being settled yet. And that's why right now we have elections based on election laws drafted unilaterally by a candidate, Mr. Aqil Saleh. The security in the south is run by another candidate, Khalifa Haftar, which led to Saif al-Islam, another candidate, being prevented from entering the appeals court to appeal his disqualification. A court in west of Tripoli has said that the laws or the regulations issued by the High Judicial Council are faulty. So right now we are in a very tight spot, and I don't think in the final analysis that any of the leading candidates, Mr. Dbeiba, the Prime Minister, Haftar or Saif, any of them will accept a win by the other party. So we are going to a street, and we know that it's a dead end, but nobody cares.
But Salah, if it's as chaotic as you describe, who is really forcing this election through? Why are they insisting on it actually happening on so specific a time that's just 3 weeks away?
Well, different parties for different reasons. The Americans and the Europeans think that it's an easy way to get the Russians out, an elected government and an elected president. The Russians think it's an easy way to get Saif into power. The Egyptians think it's the easiest way to get Haftar, after failing militarily, to get Haftar into power and create another military state in Libya. So everybody has their own interest. There are some that are out of a job now in Libya, like Mr. Bashagha, the former interior minister. He thinks that this is his only chance to get in for an executive position. And you see the 98 competitors, most of them have a snowball's chance in hell of winning, but they want to qualify themselves for maybe for a position in a cabinet or something like that.
Okay. Tim, let's for a second just ignore all the complications that Salah has described very articulately. You know, when a country is usually just a few weeks or days away from an election, you know, the press is kind of talking about a front runner and which direction a new president will take the country in. Are we seeing any of that right now in Libya? Do we even know who will be on that final approved list?
Well, it's still up for debate, isn't it? And as Salah has indicated, it's still being contested in the courts. And I think we're going to end up with quite a difficult spot here where you may get conflicting rulings by courts in different parts of the country, which then just further complicates the work of the Electoral Commission and also complicates any judgments from external countries over who might be a spoiler or not. I mean, I think this has also been a difficult part of this debate. By relying on contested laws that don't really pass the mustard of due process, there are legitimate complaints and concerns about this process, but the internationals, by just piling ahead and saying that everybody kind of needs to get in line without addressing those concerns, runs the risk of anybody who raises complaints being listed as a spoiler. And that then creates a further set of problems. So as you know, 3 weeks out, we don't even know who's going to be on the ballot. We know some of the big names, but it's very, very unlikely that any of those names can deliver a clear result. And contested basis, contested situation will lead to a contested government.
Okay. Sami, I mean, is an election really worth it at this point?
I think that when it comes to analyzing the dynamics of these elections, I think to remember that the Libyan factions were dragged kicking and screaming into a political process that none of them wanted. I think it's important to remember that the militias of Tripoli were infighting with one another until Haftar was knocking on their doorstep and they had to be bailed out by Turkey. Meanwhile, Haftar has never had his eyes on any democratic process. He has launched multiple coups and he's seeking to militarily take over Libya and establish a new authoritarian autocracy in the region, very similar to Sisi. And he expects that his guarantee of security, between quotation marks, will result in international recognition in the same way that Sisi was internationally recognized after overthrowing the democratically elected president. And these are the same dynamics that we're seeing today with the elections. Just as the Libyan parties were dragged kicking and screaming into the political process, they're being dragged kicking and screaming into an elections that Biden is impressing upon everybody has to take place. And Biden has been trying to rein in the international interest. We saw Macron trying to flex in his international conference in Paris, and Biden sent Kamala Harris to sort of temper Macron and say to the international community that Biden is still in charge of what's taking place, not Macron. I want these elections to take place. And the reality is, for the Americans, they see all of the Libyan parties equally. They see the militias as just as bad as Haftar, as just as bad as Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi. And now the focus for Biden is stability and security, not democracy or democratic transition. So the Americans hope that these elections, whatever winner it produces, they will work with them and they will recognize them. And that will be the opening chapter for moving forward. But the problem is, and going back to your question whether elections are worth it, the issue is that Libya's issue is not elections. Libya's issue is, as Salah and Tim have alluded to, the fact that there is no consensus with regards to the framework that they should take place, and therefore there is no consensus as to whether the results are legitimate or not. In 2014, there were elections, but a lack of consensus. Therefore, there was low turnout and then a rejection of the results and then an armed takeover of Tripoli, while Haftar in the east was already embarking on a military campaign to seize Libya by military rule. In other words, these elections will not necessarily solve the problem. Instead, they rather open the door to conflict that perhaps we've at least managed to close over the past few months, because as we heard al-Mishri, the head of the Presidential Council, say to Al Jazeera 3 weeks ago, if Haftar wins, we take up arms and we fight. Haftar's gamble is also that if he doesn't win and the results are unfavorable, then he's entrenched in the east and he can resist those results, and therefore he's ready to fight a renewed conflict once more. In other words, no one is ready to recognize the results. They're all being dragged to this, and the Americans' insistence on elections demonstrates rather not necessarily a naivety, but a lack of appreciation for the complexities, and quite simply an arrogance in that you're all the same, you're just a bickering bunch of Libyans, sort your problems out and I will tell you how to do it. And I think this is going to be a disaster if we don't rectify some of that.
Okay, I want to get the perspective again then from Tripoli, and there's a lot to unpack in what Sami said. Salah, first of all, that these elections could simply open the door to more severe conflict, and that the fact that none of these factions, he feels, wanted to really be part of the political process when they were dragged into it. And now the fact that in this election, in the international community and all of its, proxy players is just too heavily invested in this vote.
Well, look, everybody in Libya, I mean the majority, by far the majority of Libyans think that it's time to renew the legitimacy of their political institutions. Right now, the House of Representatives mandate ended on 20th October 2015. We are in 2021. The High Council of State, its mandate ended in 2014. It's still around. And so everybody wants to renew the legitimacy of these institutions, and that's why they went in Geneva, and they agreed unanimously to elections. The idea was to start with parliamentary elections, fix the constitutional issue, and then hold elections based on a new constitution. We've been dragging this constitutional issue for over 10 years now. However, somehow presidential elections got in, and the whole thing now is becoming a very fierce zero-sum competition about who's going to be number one. And I think, like Sami said and Tim said, this is not going to happen. Libya, in its entire history, was ruled by two men. King Idris for about 15 years, from 51 to 69, and he was a religious and a political leader. And then Gaddafi came and ruled Libya for 42 years. Libya is not in a position to be ruled by one man or one woman at this time.
Okay.
And we all know that any of the leading candidates will not accept the results of a win by the other candidates.
Right. That's why I'd heard people actually argue very cynically for Khalifa Haftar, because they somehow think that's what Libya has known. A strong dictator that forces the country to stay united is the only thing that works. It is the lesser of some very bad evils. But Salah, I want to stick with you for a minute because as we're talking about what is actually supposed to be on this ballot on December 24th, we mentioned in our introduction that Haftar has now been barred from standing for the election. Saif al-Islam has also been taken off the ballot, but they're both appealing. What are the chances that they will both appear on the election roster in 3 weeks' time?
What do you see? You see, if you just stick with me for a minute, here's the problem. Haftar was barred by a court in the West. The rules propagated by the High Judicial Council said initially that if you want to sue Haftar, you need to go to Benghazi and sue Haftar because he registered there, which means that any of the internally displaced people who were turned away from Benghazi, from their home, if they want to sue Haftar, they have to go to Benghazi, which is a danger. I cannot go there. Now, the court in Zawiya said, no, the Judicial Council is wrong. We are suing, the suit is against the commission, the election commission. Thus, anywhere you can sue anywhere, and accepted the motion to look into a lawsuit against Haftar and ruled against Haftar. Now you have a ruling against Haftar in the West and a ruling for Haftar in the East, and now who's going to resolve this when the Constitutional Court is closed by order of the Judicial Council?
Okay.
Right now we don't know until this impasse is resolved. We're going to go on like this.
Zero clarity as for the ballot list itself. Tim, let me come back to you. There's also not just the question of who's going to be running, but the question of just security in the election itself. I mean, how vulnerable is this election, not just to potential attacks, but also just to manipulation by the various parties involved?
Well, of course, there are very strong suspicions that the armed forces on the ground will try and sculpt a result that goes in their favor. We've already seen incidents, of course, of armed groups turning up outside of courts to prevent appeals. We've seen a strong reaction to Saif al-Islam's candidacy in the West and the shutting of voter registration centers in some locations. And I think the kind of processes that Salah is mentioning means that many groups will take a justification from various court rulings, contradictory ones, in support of any position that they may take, and this then becomes very tricky. And so, whilst the international community will make very clear, I think, some red lines about interfering with the poll itself, much of the maneuvering is coming before that poll, and given that the poll will also come in stages, you'll probably see things in between voting stages. I mean, it's going to be very difficult to ensure against irregularities with such a fragmented situation on the ground. And really, what hope does a Ministry of Interior have of enforcing good practices across the country? I think it's going to be largely a case of external actors trying to get people to play ball. But given the extent of the disagreements, then I think that's going to be very, very hard to do. If I may, just one point, which I think, Andrea, is really important in this, about whether elections are worth it, is the question, actually, the elections are taking place because of what it's hoped a new government could achieve. My view is that the Americans quite squarely believe that many of the problems before Libya can only be resolved with a unified legislative and executive. And only a unified government can fix the splits in institutions, can address some of the problems that Libya faces, and can be a partner for the internationals to deal with. But the trouble is that the process as it's currently crafted, for the reasons that we've discussed, creates very few opportunities for such a government to come into existence. And again, even if one of the major candidates prevails, it's very unrealistic that they're going to be able to sort of have reach across the whole of the country. And, that then raises questions about the utility of that process, particularly when, and just going back to what Salah said at the very beginning, there's nothing in place to actually address the disputed elements of the conflict. So creating a new government with a strong presidency in those circumstances is just furthering the view of many of the Libyan rivals that they've got to be the one that wins to be able to dictate their terms on the political system, and is becoming kind of part of the conflict rather than part of a conflict resolution process.
Right. When you say the disputed elements of the conflict, let me raise this with Sami then. Part of the disputed element, one of the disputed elements is the distribution of the country's resources. That still hasn't even come close to being really fairly sorted out. I mean, what kind of role is that going to play in Libya going forward?
The topic of the distribution of resources in Libya is emerging as a result of the status quo, which in and of itself is unsustainable. And this is why the Americans are pushing for elections. They understand the status quo is unsustainable. The distribution of resources is talked about in the context that you have an East Libya, West Libya, and South Libya, which is why Haftar is keen to remove South Libya by taking over it and ensuring that he's in charge of their security. And I think that's why many people are not keen to resolve this particular issue, because when you talk about the distribution, you are beginning to entrench this idea that perhaps we're going to partition. And this is why Khalid al-Mishri as well in his Al Jazeera interview, which is a very important interview, came out and said that if nobody recognizes the results of the elections, then the unfortunate reality is we will head towards this sort of partition. And this is why I think that these debates are not helpful if we are talking about how to unify Libya, how to bring them all together. And I think Tim is right to highlight that while the Americans believe that a unified legitimacy will bring Libya together, the realities on the ground suggest something completely different. And that's a result of this stalemate, this military stalemate, where Haftar is strong in the east, and in the west you have various different factions who don't see eye to eye with one another, who are wrestling with one another, each lobbying different capitals in order to assert themselves against a different party. And I think this, at the end of the day, I think what speaks volumes as to Libya's current state is that the front runners, or at least the loosely talked about front runners, are all Gaddafi-era politicians in both the east and the west. In the west, Abdel Hamid al-Dbeiba, who made his fortune under Gaddafi, and in the east, you have Haftar, Aqil al-Saleh, Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi. And if we're looking at the wider region, and this is the dark reality, this is the heartbreaking thing for those who aspire to see a progress in the Arab Spring and genuine democratic transition, in that when you look at Tunisia, we have a coup, suspension of the constitution. When you look at Morocco, going back to pre-2011 dynamics, when you see Sisi entrenched in Egypt, when you see Sudan, a coup that has now been recognized and a new agreement has come about that will see Burhan stay in power, you can see that the anti-democratic forces are beginning to deliver the nail in the coffin, and that even in Libya, we're going full circle in that there is a legitimate argument that the Libyans themselves, in their nostalgia for security and stability, these two buzzwords that drive the international community's approach to Libya, that allowed Trump to sit back and watch Haftar bombard Libya, bombard Tripoli on the basis that he would bring security and stability. Okay. The reality is that Libya today, even if there were free and fair elections, it's not guaranteed that democratic trends will win. And I think this is the tragedy of what is unfolding when we're looking at Libya, in that either we are looking at the return of autocracy via elections or return of autocracy via conflict.
I mean, Salah, we have just a minute left. Those are the two options that Sami has laid out, but it's also been mentioned over and over, this potential for partition of the country. How do Libyans feel about that?
Well, most people don't want partition of the country. The East is afraid that it will be isolated and will be an easy prey for the Egyptians. There are, over 1 million Libyans living in Egypt. They were kicked out of the east of Libya 300, 400 years ago. By Westerners helping other Easterners. So they are afraid that the Egyptians will push those back into Libya and take over the east of Libya. The Westerners are worried about the oil in the oil crescent, and the South wants access to the sea. So nobody really wants a partition, but But everybody wants a fair distribution of wealth, and that's the crux of the problem in Libya.
Okay.
That's why the attacks on Tripoli. That's why everybody wants to take power, because of the money. Unless we reach a fair economic agreement between all Libyans that can be put in a constitution, I think we'll continue in this terrible path.
Still not sure what an election can solve here. But Salah, I will have to give you the final word. We are unfortunately very much out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of you really so much for being with us, and our viewers as well. Remember to follow us on Twitter @_newsmakers, or subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.